demonstration in support of the jailed Elaine Brown supporters provides the foreground for an interesting story, an interesting thing I discovered today. It relates to the real ID and also to the Ed and Elaine Brown situation. As of yesterday, March 24th, 2008, Marshals at the U.S. courthouse in Concord, New Hampshire, have decided to do something that hasn't been done in years. They've been requiring identification to enter the building. They say it's because of this particular trial, the trial of the 4 Ed Brown supporters. They've indicated the ID requirement may end after the trial is over. Marshal Elizabeth Michaelson told me the reason for the change is to avoid witness contamination, making sure people who are witnesses to the trial, or at the trial, don't enter the building at a time when they might end up hearing testimony they're not supposed to hear. This, of course, has real ID implications. That's because the way it works with real ID is this. If you want to go into a federal facility like this one, it's not a big deal. You wouldn't need a real ID to do it, as long as no ID was required in the first place. So there's not necessarily going to be new places where you need an ID. It's just that if you had to show an ID to begin with, now you're going to have to show a real ID. Well, before, this courthouse was a place where you didn't have to show an ID, so it was not going to be affected by the real ID. This raises questions. This suddenly, imposition of the ID regimen raises questions as to whether or not you really might need a real ID to get into this courthouse. Well, of course, New Hampshire, they're not going to have real ID. So you might not be able to get into this courthouse with a New Hampshire ID. If this were done again after the real ID deadline, and if there were not some sort of arrangement or compromise reached. But if the current policy stays in place past May 11th, then on May 12th, you might not be able to walk into this building with anything other than a passport or a driver's license from a state that is not New Hampshire. Predictably enough, local activists are not amused.
Now, what's really interesting is, and ironic, is we come into town today to fight against real ID, and all of a sudden they're asking for ID in a federal courthouse. I hope that's not foreshadowing for things to come.
In other real ID news, kind of more on the state level, the committee hearing this surreptitious Senate amendment bill that would sort of ask the governor to bend over on real ID, that hearing did go on, and some of the reps were able to speak against real ID, but they cut the hearing short and extended it to Thursday. So Thursday, March 27th, the real ID amendment to this unrelated bill will come under discussion at the State House. And look in my video description for more details. This is Dave Ridley signing off for ridleyreport.com this March 25th, 2008. Are you a student who longs for liberty? Are you a student who rocks at writing? Then be gone from the Ridley Report and get your butt over to nhlibertyessay.com. nhlibertyessay.com is offering up to $100 for the student who writes the best essay about liberty. So head on over to nhlibertyessay.com.